So hello everyone, and welcome to our tech session for today. It is our platform updates and upgrades. The session is being recorded and it's led by Eric, our head of product. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Eric. Thank you.
So basically, I'm just going to go through the new functionality that we've added to the runtime, specifically in the last two updates. For those of you actually using it, will be 0.9.6 and 0.9.7, which is the update we're about to release. And yeah, I think I'll just get right into it. I'm going to start with 0.9.7 and just show some of the new things there because they're more visually accessible. And then I'll talk some more about some of the new functionality that was added in 0.9.6 as well. So, did you guys see this runtime dashboard screen?
Yes.
Okay, so the first new thing is we've added a new runtime dashboard. Everything used to just be accessible through the Swagger interface. That is still accessible, but we've added this dashboard to make the most common things that you would want to do a bit easier. So we've got kind of a check of the system health, and then here you can see the next new thing, which is we have multiple campaigns deployed to this single runtime instance. For the previous versions, you could only have one campaign deployed to each runtime instance. And this update adds the functionality to have multiple campaigns deployed, and then depending on the campaign ID that you pass in through the API call, it will use the appropriate logic to produce a result for you. There's a couple of advantages to being able to do that. The main one is you can save on infrastructure because you don't have repeated overhead of the operating system effectively that the runtime instance is running on. So if you kind of a relatively low volume deployment, then you can put all of the runtimes in one place and save there. And even if you are running it at higher volumes, instead of scaling each runtime to say 6 pods or whatever terminology you use, you can instead have one deployment with lots of pods and all the cases deployed to all the pods, and it load balances across them. So you can then use your hardware more efficiently because it's not kind of load balancing across one case, it's across all of them. And again, but you would also, even if that wasn't there, save on that base kind of operating system resource requirement. It's also just kind of more convenient. So if you have an example you're playing with or something you're testing, or you're kind of deploying an ecogentic agent that will use multiple runtimes in a journey, you can put them all in one place and have them all running together. So yeah, that's quite a useful piece of new functionality. And you can see basically it'll just keep a list of all of the configurations that you have deployed to a specific runtime endpoint. The next thing we've got on the dashboard is just our invocations test. So this is to let you make a basic call to a configuration and see the results and potentially send a response. So you put in your campaign so it knows where to go, your customer channel and the number of offers, and then it will generate the response and allow you to generate responses, like say that something was accepted if you want to. So obviously there's a lot more API calls you can make, and those are still accessible in the Swagger, but that's kind of the most common thing that we've seen people doing. Then we include code snippets for that, making that call in different languages. So the specific call that we've just made, if you want to run it with curl, you can call it here and have nice formatting with JQ if you want, and get the UUID. And then if you want to send a response to register that it was accepted with curl, you can do it here. So you can copy those out and use them as you want to. If you want something in some sort of shell script, or then we have the same thing in Python, Java, C#, and TypeScript. So once you have seen that you can make this call through this dashboard, you can then implement it in whichever language you might want to make the call from, based on the flow that you're using. So that's just to kind of make it a bit easier if you want to directly call the runtime from one of these languages. Then the next thing is, yeah, but also a big thing we've added is the like a built-in model context protocol interface. So previously there was a separate image and container that provided the MCP interface, and that is still available, but it's now also just built into the base runtime. There's a number of tools that are available to your agent to allow it to interact with the runtime and use the results of whatever you've configured as part of your agentic workflow, and then also register responses if they need to be registered. So you can get the campaigns that are available. You can use invoke to then get a response to send it back. And then update properties and generate class allow you to actually influence the configuration of the runtime through your agents. Update properties will allow you to update the configuration of the case, and generate class will allow you to compile a custom Java class to use as your pre or post scoring logic that is being used to generate the result you get back when you use the invoke tool. So having that MCP here, I think, is quite useful. It just removes that hurdle of having an additional layer to install to have the MCP available. And you can also see, if you need it, we provide configurations you can copy across for most of the most commonly used tools, so that you can link your runtime into those environments. And then the last thing is there's some cloud deployment configurations that you can use as a starting point for setting this up in different cloud environments, and then also on Kubernetes or Docker if you are using that for your on-prem environment. So that's the main dashboard and covers a lot of the things we've added here. MCP, you can see, is just what I was talking about with the MCP. Something else that we have added an initial version of, and we are still going to work to refine, is to allow to automate the testing for the runtime deployments. So if you go to the testing dashboard, you can select a campaign. You can also view the config for the runtime. But what will happen here is that the runtime will automatically generate Cucumber tests for this configuration and then run them. So you can see there's still a few bugs we're working out, but the idea is that it goes through all of the configuration that you've created and all of the databases and things that you've linked, and will create test cases for different variations of those and generate data to allow them to be tested. We'll go through your custom pre and post scoring logic that you may have added and create test cases for that, then run all of those tests. So it will produce this report, ideally saying all of them are passed, but it's from basic things like the plugin, the preschool class is what you'd expect it to be, and the post-school class is what you'd expect it to be, to does the pre and post-school classes loads, but also we'll check kind of methods within your logic. So, check that your contextual variable values are being appropriately processed and all those things. So that, I think, is quite useful functionality just to check that your deployment configuration is working as expected, but also can be used in any sort of automated CI/CD pipeline to do some validation before you do any deployment. And it's split into these different sections of the runtime logic. And then the final piece of the dashboard is this config check that it's going to take a while to run because I've got a database issue that it's picking up, but that will show us like what the status of the server that the runtime is connected to is, the database, and various other things, so you can have a view of what your environment looks like. Actually, I'll just leave that running while I talk through the 096 piece. So yeah, those are, the other thing that we did is just improve the threading performance. So that now works more efficiently, which is useful for having multiple cases in the single runtime instance. Obviously, we're still in preview for the next few days, so the release notes are quite high level, but to summarize, we've got the built-in MCP. You can deploy multiple use cases to a single runtime instance. There's automated testing and the new runtime dashboard, and then kind of more under the hood, but enabling all of this to happen is the improved threading performance. So before I go to 096, I thought I'd just check if there's any questions on what I've showed so far before I carry on.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it. I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat.
Okay, cool. Yeah, in 096, we also introduced quite a lot of functionality. The first thing was this just-in-time Java compilation. So instead of, if you use the custom pre and post scoring logic functionality where you need to do something beyond the standard configuration, instead of having to build an entire jar and package that into an image, you can just compile a class for that specific piece of code, and it will automatically be set up and running in your container. So that helps a lot with process things to have that option available. You don't need any sort of Java build pipeline if you want to use custom pre and post scoring logic. I'm going to skip over some of it, like threading performance and open API updates and things. We did also split the runtime into with and without deep learning options here, just because the without deep learning one is so much smaller, and bundling it all together was unnecessary for some use cases. Call parallel deployment is also something we added. It's functionality to allow you to call one runtime asynchronously from another. Obviously, that can be used in many ways, but the reason for adding it was to allow for testing of different types of deployments. So you can have your existing runtime, which has a given configuration and approach. So say you're using a static model, a GBM to rank offers. You can, if you're wanting to test a dynamic recommender, you can deploy that and then have the static model call the dynamic recommender as part of its flow, and it does it asynchronously, so it doesn't add to the load. And that allows you to then see what would the results have been using that dynamic model to validate your approach. If you want to have a cautious rollout to production and you don't actually want to expose it to customers at all before you've done some of that real world testing. So that functionality is there. We also added the functionality to pass the Mongo client into your pre-scoring logic. So that allows you to manipulate the data in the Mongo database before the predictions happen. We also use it for doing real-time data updates. So you can use that functionality to load data into the Mongo database as part of the case. So yeah, that was also added. Then we have allowing multiple tables to be combined into our customer feature store. So prior to this 096, you had to have a table that you would look up your customer interaction from. And you could also have additional tables that you would load into memory, but they would be kind of read in as a whole table. But what you can do as of this 096 update is set up multiple different tables. So say your customer data is spread across multiple different tables for whatever reason, and it's too difficult to combine them into a single one, you can do multiple lookups, which the runtime will then combine into a single feature store that can be used for your scoring. Obviously, the trade-off there is doing multiple lookups can increase your latency, but if that is within the threshold of what you need your latency to be, then sometimes it can make things possible that weren't previously possible if it's just too much bureaucracy to combine everything into a single table. And the last major thing that was part of this initial 096 release was custom rewards functions for the dynamic recommender. The dynamic recommenders are our continuous learning algorithms that use the real-time interactions and logging data to update the offers that they show. This functionality allows you to, using Java code, customize how that updating happens. If you have a set of offers and then being accepted should have a bigger weight somehow, or you want a specific function to be used to update to inform the size of the updates, you can code that in, and the algorithm will then learn based on that function. So that was the initial 096 release. Then we also added in 096.1 the ability to use another runtime as a data source that you're looking up from. So prior to that, you could look up from Mongo, Cassandra, or Trino/Presto, or Postgres. But the constraint you had there was that everything had to be in a single database, because each runtime instance is configured to connect to a specific database. So if you want to look up some data from one Mongo instance and more other data from a different one, and you have 3 different Cassandras set up and you need to look up data from all of them, you can set up runtimes that do those data lookups and then use those as your data sources for your runtime that actually does the logic. If you have a highly kind of horizontally scaled case, that can also help with the number of connections that you open to the database, because you can have all of your pods pointing to a single place that has the connection to the database, assuming that your database lookup is your bottleneck that's causing your latency. We also added a number of new dynamic engagement algorithms, the human behavior algorithms. I won't go through the details of all of them now, but if you go to dynamic algorithms and overview, you can see the list of them and then kind of details of what they're good at and how they work and all of those things. So we added that set of dynamic algorithms, these behavioral sub-approaches. So that was added. We also added support for virtual variables, which is again kind of just a data convenience thing. So if your feature store has age in it and your model needs an age bucket, so I don't know, below 30 and above 30, previously you had to add that as a field to your table that was formed your customer feature store, but now you can configure that as a virtual variable, which will then be added to the customer feature store in the runtime and can then be used in the scoring. So again, it's just adds a little bit of work into the runtime, but it means that if it's difficult for you to add fields to your customer table, you can use that functionality. Then we also added a couple of convenience API. We've always had the refresh API, which kind of updates everything, but we added the refresh with options API, which will go to connect to the server and also re-update your option store, which is part of your dynamic recommender algorithm. So if you've changed the offers that are available, your offer matrix, and you want those changes to propagate everywhere, you can use that single API call. There's also the learning API, which manually triggers the dynamic interaction learning if it is running on a monitoring delay, which is useful for testing. So if you have it set to kind of learn every 2 minutes, if you make a change, it's kind of frustrating to have to wait for the learning period to pass before you can see if the change you made actually worked. You can call the learning API to check it immediately. And then there's an update Cassandra config API, which will just update your Cassandra conf file based on the input that you pass it. And then we also had our first version of the MCP integration. Like I said, that's a separate image that you can use, but we now have it built into the base runtime as well. And we added MLflow integration. So if you have models in MLflow, you can reference them in a config file and their runtime and their version and all those things that the runtime will pull them in as part of the deployment rather than having to specify the name of the model. So if you're training your models outside of the ecosystem environment and you are storing them in MLflow, then you can use that functionality to more easily access them. And then there was, I think, just few more small things that were in the rest of these. The rest of these are kind of bug fixes or vulnerability updates. So the first was we allowed for the rewards functions that I mentioned for your dynamic recommenders to be asymmetric. So you can have a different reward for a response and a fail. So if something gets taken up, it can be treated one way, and if it's not taken up, it can be treated in a completely different way. Whereas before, it would kind of go up or down by the same amount for a specific offer, depending on whatever your function was, but it didn't have the context of the success or the failure. So we added that, which is quite useful, obviously. And then there was a fix, which I think was mentioned in the description, for if you set your continuous learning to happen on an interval that ended up with overlapping learning happening, that could cause some issues. So we fixed that as well. And then we get to 097, which I've showed you guys. So those are the updates for the last two minor releases. Like I said, this 097 is still officially in preview, but we're planning to release it by the end of the week. So it will be available for use shortly. Cheers.
Thanks, bye.